Well, Abraham Lincoln managed to leave a fair impact as his role as a one-time representative for the state of Illinois, but he would run again some 10 years later in 1858, famously for the role of senator from Illinois under the newly established Republican Party. Now, it was during this time when he was actually nominated to run for senator that he gave his famous House Divided speech, in which he said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." Let me read to you the great quote from this. "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it, and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in a course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward, till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. Have we no tendency to the latter condition? Let anyone who doubts carefully contemplate that now almost complete legal combination, that piece of machinery, so to speak, compounded by the Nebraska Doctrine and the Dred Scott decision." So he called attention to the fact that the United States would either have to choose to be all free or all slave, but he proposed it was becoming all slave. He goes on, "Such a decision is all that slavery now lacks of being alike lawful in all the states. Welcome or unwelcome, such decision is probably coming, and will soon be upon us. Unless the power of the present political dynasty shall be met and overthrown, we shall lie down pleasantly dreaming that the people of Missouri are on the verge of making their state free, and we shall awake to the reality instead that the Supreme Court has made Illinois a slave state," in which he was commenting, of course, on the Dred Scott decision. In other words, this speech, which by many is seen as almost harmless or really just as inspiring, which it was incredibly inspiring. People stopped and dropped their jaws when they heard it, and he had quite a way with words. But this speech by the Southerners, regardless of whether or not they were pro-slavery or anti-slavery, they saw this speech as aggressive. They saw this speech really as a precursor to war. That's why the South was really opposed to Abraham Lincoln as a senator, even though he was running just for Illinois, but would especially be opposed to him as a presidential candidate in 1860. Still, in 1858, his race against Stephen Douglas, who was known as the Little Giant, did not actually succeed. He actually lost that race to Douglas, who became senator, even though they had 5 very famous and quite interesting debates. But this really would allow him to go on 2 years later and to run for president. Now, the election of 1860 is a curious election. There were 5 major candidates. I'm sorry, not 5. There were 4 major candidates. There were additional candidates as well, but there were 4 primary ones. In fact, the Democratic Party itself actually had 2 different candidates. And I want to tell you about each of these men. The first was Stephen Douglas, that opponent of Lincoln's during the debates in Illinois. He was the senator from Illinois, and he was someone who argued that the whole slavery issue should simply be decided by popular vote. Let each of the states decide whether or not they want to be slave or free. Really, he's what we call a pragmatist. He was someone who simply said, listen, if it works, do it. If it doesn't work, don't do it. Forget about what's just or unjust. And so Douglas ended up carrying only the state of Missouri, curiously enough, and did not actually win the election or come close to win the election. There was another Democrat by the name of John Breckinridge who really ran for the South. In fact, he carried most of the southern states and really ran under the fact that states have a right to decide whether or not they're going to be slave or free, and the federal government has nothing to do with it. And so, as I mentioned, he carried those southern states. He was opposed, along with Douglas, by another party known as the Constitutional Union Party. They were led by their candidate, John Bell. And Bell had a very curious position. His position was very much like the Founding Fathers. That was Focus on the limits the Constitution gives you. Do not go beyond these constitutional limits, and you won't have to worry about such things as civil war. The Constitution clearly outlines a federal government and a state's rights aspect. Of course, the whole problem was that people always wanted further definition. People always wanted to ask, well, how far can I go? How far down this road can I take power if I'm the federal government or if I'm the state? And so John Bell's very principled constitutional argument was largely ignored. Still, he carried some of the most key states in the entire war between the states, such as Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. So it shows you where their loyalties lay, which were really with the Constitution. But of course, the candidate who won the election was Abraham Lincoln, who was a Republican candidate. He ran with the vice presidential candidate, William Seward, who had called the coming struggle an irrepressible conflict. In other words, war was essentially going to happen. And both these men were strong Unionists. Both of these men were essentially nationalists. It was Union at all costs, and we will use force to make sure that Union happens. As a result, they took almost all of the northern states as well as the West Coast, Oregon and California at that time. It's curious, 10 states, all of them southern, not only did they not elect Lincoln as their president, but they actually cast 0 votes for him. I can't think of another election where a state has cast 0 votes for a primary candidate, let alone the guy who actually becomes president. Lincoln won the presidency with one of the narrowest majorities of all time. He won about 40% of the vote and 180 electoral votes, just barely enough to actually secure the presidency, in which he did secure it fairly. But the point is this, it really shows the division you see present at that time. Now, as we've already mentioned, Lincoln was a complex man, and we need to go into that in further detail. Now, Lincoln did consistently stand against slavery. He really did believe that slavery was a moral wrong. And the Republicans themselves were often called free soilers. And free soilers believed that all new states particularly should be free states. They should not have slavery out of there. The problem was they didn't always view these things from a moral high ground. Most of the reason why they didn't want slavery in these new states was because they did not want slave labor to compete with essentially white people. In fact, the Republican Party was called by one of its founders the White Man's Party. And Lincoln himself, between 1854 and 1860, would publicly, some 16 different times, declare that he did not believe African Americans were equal to white Americans. So even though he was principally against slavery, it wasn't always for the most noble reasons. Now, I have no interest in trying to make Lincoln into a villain. He was not a villain. He really was a good man. But like all of us, he was colored by the problems of his time. And so Lincoln, who often saw things very clearly from moral grounds, was also sometimes sometimes saw things through a bad lens. But still, the whole point is this. Lincoln really was a Unionist. In fact, let me read to you part of a letter he wrote to the famous abolitionist Horace Greeley. He wrote this in 1862. "My paramount object in this struggle, which would be the Civil War, is to save the Union. It is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save the Union by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I would do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union." And so that really was the motivation that actually drove Lincoln. So for example, Lincoln is famous for giving the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves in the South. At least that's what we commonly think. However, when you read the Emancipation Proclamation, you see that it has all of these qualifiers or limits put upon it. In fact, the Emancipation Proclamation only freed the slaves in the portions of the South which the Union troops did not control or occupy. In other words, Lincoln had the opportunity with the Emancipation Proclamation to free slaves in places like Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, or Maryland, or Delaware, and he chose not to. In fact, when he walked on his way to the White House every day, he passed by a slave market. He did nothing about that slave market. It wouldn't be until a constitutional amendment actually righted slavery by getting rid of it that that slave market would actually be closed down. And so Lincoln really was not a man who was always morally opposed to slavery. He used it primarily as a military measure. The Emancipation Proclamation was designed to allow slaves to run away from their masters' homes and create havoc in the South, thus preventing the South from effectively fighting the war. So unfortunately, this proclamation, which is still beautifully written, was not always done on the best grounds. Another issue that we see during the war is that Lincoln and the Republicans and the Unionists had no problem in using African Americans as slave labor in the construction of their fortresses. So for example, you get a place like Fort Negley in Nashville, which was built at the cost, they estimate, of 600 to 800 slaves' lives, which is an incredible toll for building any structure. It actually harkens back to some of the stats we get from antiquity. The other thing that we see about Lincoln was that Lincoln really was a statist. He really did believe the state was the greatest organizing force for good. That's why he supported things like the tariff, or subsidies, or the control of trade by the government, or fiat money. In fact, in 1862, Lincoln created fiat money. That was paper money that was not backed by gold or silver and was only controlled in value, technically by the government, but even the government can finally control that. He also established things such as the first income tax and created the IRS in 1862. It would be shut down and resurrected later by Woodrow Wilson, but it really began with Lincoln himself. He was a man who shot down peace proposals by the Confederate States because he did not believe that they should be allowed to exist separately. So even as late as March of 1862, when the Confederates proposed a peace plan in which they would pay for Fort Sumter, which they had conquered, he rejected even hearing the negotiations of that peace plan. He also rejected letting Napoleon III, who was the King of France, negotiate between the South and the North. It was union or nothing. And so during the war, Lincoln made incredibly tough decisions that really reflect someone who was so committed to the idea of union and to political union that he was willing to actually be like a dictator. It would be during the course of the war that he would imprison over 13,000 political dissidents. Those are people who actually opposed or spoke out against his policies or the policies of the Union government. And of course, it wasn't like Lincoln was doing all this directly. He had a large administration and really a Union army under his command to do these things. But the point is this: they happened under his leadership. These people were imprisoned without charge. People such as the entire legislature of the state of Maryland, who was trying to secede, and Lincoln prevented them from seceding. Because if they seceded with Virginia, that would make Washington, D.C. in the middle of two states who were no longer a part of the Union. He imprisoned them for 2 years. He also occupied Delaware with military troops, would do the same in places like Kansas and Kentucky, putting both of them under martial law, that essentially is a rule by the military. Many of these dissidents, including men like Francis Key Howard, who was the grandson of the writer of the Star-Spangled Banner, were imprisoned in Fort McHenry in Baltimore, ironically the same place where his grandfather had written the Star-Spangled Banner. He would also close hundreds of newspapers that actually spoke out about his violations of the Constitution. Newspapers, for example, such as the New York Daily News, the Brooklyn Eagle, the Louisville Courier, the Maryland News Sheet, or the Philadelphia Evening Journal. These were newspapers from all over the country. And even though he stood against secession, the whole idea that states could actually secede from the Union, he actually encouraged West Virginia to secede from Virginia. As a result, Lincoln, when he was reelected in 1864, was praised by men who had a similar nationalistic viewpoint. Both Karl Marx and Giuseppe Garibaldi, the actual one who unified Italy violently, both praised Lincoln as being a modern hero. And if you're a true modernist, which means you're a statist, then Lincoln is indeed a hero. Now, the whole point is not to make Lincoln into this villain. It's to show you that Lincoln had a very distinctive worldview. And that worldview was dangerous because he applied it fully and with full faith. We'll take a look at his actual Christianity in the next lesson.